do apologize for my voice. I realize I'm a little congested. It's just this time of year with the cold weather. So I do apologize for the way my voice sounds today. Hello and welcome to What a Ghoul Wants. My name is Anna. I am your ghoul. And what I want is to talk about underrated men in horror. So today I'm talking about underrated male characters in the horror genre. This is kind of a companion video to the video I made on underrated women in the horror genre. So you can check that out if you haven't already. So this is just going to be me talking about male characters that I personally think are underrated in horror. Now, if you did watch my underrated women in horror video, you'll know that I had a decent amount of protagonists on that list. I did have a couple of characters that you could consider anti-heroes or villains. And on this list of underrated male characters, there are quite a few more villains than the women in horror list. I debated whether or not making a separate underrated villains in horror list, and I might end up doing that and just not include the ones that I've already talked about in this video and the underrated women in horror list. But yeah, I gotta see about that. I just ended up with more villains on this one than I thought I would, but I also really debated on whether or not to include the subject of my shirt, and that is Daniel Kaluuya in Get Out, his character Chris, and I wasn't sure if he could be considered underrated. I do know that Daniel Kaluuya received an Oscar nomination for his role as Chris, but he didn't win, so I don't know, I really debated whether or not to put him on here. So I guess I'll add him as kind of like an honorable mention. So please sound off in the comments, let me know, do you think that Chris is an underrated character, or do you think that he gets the credit that he deserves? And this shirt, by the way, is from Studio House Designs. They're awesome. I've bought from them several times, and they do great work. They have great designs and tons of different horror movies. Long sleeve tees, short sleeve, tie-dye. Super cool. Please check them out. So yeah, this is a list of, technically it's 12 characters. I am lumping 2 sets of 2 together because I just couldn't leave them out when I was talking about the movie. I had to include 2 characters from the movie because to me they're kind of intertwined, I guess. Like, it's hard to talk about one without talking about the other. So there are 2 twofers on this list. So without further ado, the first character I want to talk about is Marty from The Cabin in the Woods. The Cabin in the Woods is such a unique film. I saw it in theaters when it first came out and it really blew me away. It's probably my favorite horror comedy, although I'd have to say that Tucker and Dale versus Evil is up there as well, but The Cabin in the Woods is just so good. And the character of Marty is so memorable. He is our lovable stoner, kind of in the same vein as like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo.
Primo. Oh man, talk about toasted.
And normally, stoners in movies are portrayed as stupid, and Marty is not portrayed that way at all. In fact, he is the one who is aware of what's going on, the one who catches on the quickest when he realizes that there are kind of horror movie tropes happening, and he's trying to avoid him and his friends getting caught up in some sort of horror story. So, to me, he reminds me a lot of Randy from Scream. Randy walked so that Marty could run, for sure. And he's just a really likable character, very lovable, very sweet with all of his friends, and just wants to look out for them and make sure they're okay. And he wants to have a good time while doing it, of course. We see him smoking in pretty much every scene. And this might be kind of a spoiler, but it's his smoking that is a huge asset to him. He's very resourceful. He actually turns his homemade coffee mug bong thing into a weapon. He is running around, he's saving people, he's making smart decisions. And I think we talk about Cabin in the Woods, but we don't talk about the individual characters as much. And I think especially Marty deserves a lot of love. He is just a really well-written character, very distinct, and just a really fun character that we really latch onto in the movie. And he's portrayed by Fran Kranz, or Fran Kranz, I'm not sure how you say his name, but he does such an excellent job in playing Marty. And I heard, I'm not sure where I heard this, but apparently he's very fit, very buff. And they actually had him wear a lot of layers and things to kind of hide his physique because they didn't want him to show up Chris Hemsworth, if that tells you anything, which I had no idea. You can't really tell in the movie, but it definitely serves him because he's going around and he is using his strength and using his physicality against the monsters in the film. I'm kind of surprised that Marty hasn't become more of like a stoner horror movie lover icon, actually. But he is one of my favorite parts of Cabin in the Woods, and he definitely deserves more love. Next is my first set of two, and that is Yoon Sang-hwa and Sokwu from Train to Busan. Now, I do apologize if I said those names wrong. I do not speak Korean, and I'm trying my best, so I really apologize if I said those names wrong. Sokwu is played by Gong-yu, and Yoon Sang-hwa is played by Ma Dong-seok. Sokwu is more of our main character. We see him through the whole film. We start out the film with him. And he goes through a lot of character development, going from kind of like that overworked businessman who doesn't spend enough time with his family to really realizing by the end of the film that family is really all that matters, and that being a decent human being to your fellow humans is the most important thing. And Yoon Sang-hwa is a really likable character right off the bat. You just see him on the train with his pregnant wife, and he just has a really great personality, and you really latch onto him right from the get-go. So when the two of them team up, they really make a good partnership. They kind of balance each other out. They just go on fighting all of these zombies on the train. They are trying their best to protect the other people on the train. They kind of are made into leaders of the group and making the decisions to try to keep everyone safe. And there's a sequence where it's just them and another younger guy just beating up on these zombies, and they kind of get all suited up with makeshift protective gear, and both of them make huge sacrifices in the film. I'm not gonna spoil it for anybody, but the fact that they make these sacrifices really just illustrates how they came into themselves as characters and shows you why they're people that you want to root for the whole time. And they're both likable in their own ways. I definitely think that over the course of the film, you see how Sokwu grows as a character, and I think that's definitely a testament to Gong-yu and his acting abilities, and they're both just very distinct personalities. They may be way more well-known in South Korea, but I think in America, we know the movie Train to Busan, and I know that it's a really popular movie, but I don't see people talking about the characters themselves as much. So I definitely think that they deserve more recognition. Next is the first villain on my list, and that is the Hitchhiker from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. Now, everybody knows Leatherface. We love Leatherface, and for good reason. But I think that the Hitchhiker largely gets left out of the conversation when we talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he is such a memorable character. He's our first encounter with the Sawyer family when they pick him up on the side of the road, and he really sets the tone for the rest of the movie. Just how he acts in the van with the kids is a perfect indication of what is going to happen to them later when they get to the Sawyer house. And Edwin Neal plays him perfectly. Honestly, it's kind of hard to tell that he's acting because he's just so into the character, and he's so believable as this kind of demented but wanting to seem good-natured person. And he's got the birthmark on his face, which is very iconic. When he is describing the process of slaughtering cows to the kids in the van, and you just see the looks on their faces and they're just mortified, but he's very happily going about telling them this story. It's such a distinct character, and he maintains that throughout the film. And even when Sally is escaping at the end, he is absolutely ruthless. He's chasing after her with that knife, slashing at her back. And when they're at the dinner table scene, he's just cheering on Grandpa to try to get him to hit Sally with that sledgehammer. He's just like all in with what the family does, and it's really contrasted with Leatherface, who is very distraught by what's happening. He doesn't take joy in killing these kids, but I think the Hitchhiker does. And especially Edwin Neal deserves more credit for his performance as the Hitchhiker. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre just would not be the same without him. Next is Sheriff Eben Olson from 30 Days of Night. Sheriff Olson is played by the iconic Josh Hartnett, who I had really only seen in The Faculty and Halloween H2O or H20, whatever you want to call it. And I thought he was good in those. I just really appreciate seeing him all grown up and with a normal haircut for once. His hair in both of those movies is just absolutely ridiculous, but his character in 30 Days of Night is so commendable. He is trying to take care of this tiny Alaskan town and save it from these vampires. So we see him really taking action as we would assume the sheriff of the town would do. But he really goes the extra mile when he's trying to protect the citizens. And even when he has to go against the vampires, people in his town who have been turned into vampires, he faces them and he realizes that he has to kill them. Otherwise, he's going to jeopardize the remaining people who have not been turned into vampires or killed by the vampires. So he takes the really hard task of having to essentially kill his friends who have been turned so that they don't end up hurting other people. And that's such a hard thing to do. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine having to kill some of your best friends. Because this town is so small that he literally knows every single person. And we get a lot of good shots of him hacking away at vampires with axes, shooting at them. Lots of really good action scenes. And Josh Hartnett's acting is just top notch. He really shows a good range of emotions. And I like that this role is a little more action-y than his roles in Halloween H2O and The Faculty. Now, I have not read the book, 30 Days of Night, the comic book, so I don't know how his character in the movie compares to the one in the book. But to me, it's a very memorable character. And I actually just watched 30 Days of Night for the first time for my 25 days of winter/holiday horror challenge. So you can check out that video if you'd like to see all of the movies that I list there. And I did watch it a little bit early. Shh, don't tell anybody. And this is a spoiler for those who have not seen the movie, so just a warning. If you want to skip ahead a couple seconds, maybe like 30 seconds. But he makes the ultimate sacrifice at the end of the film. He realizes that the only way the other people can escape is if someone turns themselves into a vampire and fights the vampires with the newfound strength that they'll get. So he takes one for the team and he injects himself with vampire blood so that he can be the one to go and fight the vampires. And at the end, we see him destroyed by the sunlight and ultimately killed so that the other people can live. And I think that's just so commendable. So yeah, I think that Sheriff Eben Olson really needs to be talked about more. Next is another villain, and that is Joseph from Creep. Mark Duplass plays Joseph. He's this sort of recluse that pays a man to come and film him talking to his not yet born son so that he can leave a message for his son because he is dying of cancer. It turns out that might not be 100% true. And the whole time he's kind of just pushing the boundaries of appropriateness and what is okay to say in front of a stranger. And I think that Creep is such an interesting movie because you don't quite see as many horror films where it's kind of a one-on-one, two men together, where one of the men is sort of unhinged and the other is trying to figure out what's going on, trying to assess if they are in danger. And that's exactly what happens in Creep. The only really other movies I can think of like that are Come to Daddy, the Elijah Wood film. So it's very unique in that way. But we also just get to see Mark Duplass's acting chops, and he is so good, especially in a role where he has to be simultaneously friendly and outgoing, but also has kind of an underlying layer of sinister energy and creepy. I mean, Creep, it's in the title, and he for sure comes across as creepy. He just has this way of smiling, but also behind his eyes, there's a darkness, and that is just a testament to Mark Duplass as an actor. Plus the whole Peach Fuzz scene where he's singing that song.
Hello, my name is Peach Fuzz. I might look like I eat you up.
So creepy. I'm kind of surprised that Peach Fuzz hasn't become more of an icon as well. Like, I don't ever see anyone dressing up as Peach Fuzz for Halloween or anything like that. Not like Jason or Freddy or Michael. And I have yet to see Creep 2, so I'm not sure how he is in that. I'm assuming it's kind of just the same thing, maybe even more extreme. So I really need to see Creep 2 for sure. But yeah, just Mark Duplass's pacing and his line delivery. And of course that ending, I'm not going to spoil that for anybody either, but what a memorable ending. So yeah, Joseph from Creep is absolutely a horror icon in my eyes and definitely deserves to be talked about more. Next is Mark Lewis from Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is sometimes referred to as one of the proto-slashers. It came out in 1960, so the same year as Psycho, but does not get talked about nearly as much as Psycho. I know that obviously Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho are just integral in the horror genre, and we just don't hear about Peeping Tom nearly as much. And it definitely feels more like a modern movie in my opinion compared to Psycho. And partly I think that's because it is in color as opposed to black and white, but also just the way it's shot is very Giallo-esque to me. So it seems like it's kind of ahead of its time by at least 10 years. And Carl Bohm is excellent as Mark, just very creepy, kind of an awkward guy. Definitely someone trying to appear to be normal, but you can tell there's something under the surface that's just wrong. And his murder weapon is one of the most iconic weapons. It's his video camera, and he sticks a sharp implement on the end of one of the tripod legs. And so he films his victims while he is killing them with this weapon, which is just so sinister and so scary. It really harkens to a lot of serial killers who took videos of their victims. So in that way, it adds a very scary realness to the story. And I really think Peeping Tom just deserves more credit for the ground that it laid for future horror films. And that absolutely would not have been possible without Carl Bohm as Mark Lewis. Next is yet another villain, and that is Mick Taylor from Wolf Creek. Mick Taylor is such a terrifying character. He is based off of the Backpack Murders, and he's just this guy who hangs out in the outback and waits for tourists or helpless people to come along, and he plays these sick games with them and ultimately kills them. He's played by John Jarratt, who I know is huge in Australia. He is definitely a well-known star over there, and I think people in America know him some, mostly just from this movie, but he is an incredible actor, and Mick Taylor is just so terrifying, and I think a big part of that is the way that John Jarratt plays him. He injects him with a lot of humor, and it's the whole reason why the tourists will allow him to help them, because he's making jokes, he's being very jovial, he kind of lures them in with this backwoods Australian charm, and he takes advantage of them that way. And then he just turns on a dime and becomes this disgusting and awful person who commits these heinous acts. But I think that's what makes a really good villain, is someone who is not just 100% pure evil and you just hate them from the get-go. There are no redeeming qualities about them. I think having a villain that is a little bit charming is, number one, more realistic. I mean, think about how many terrible people out there who were able to commit really terrible acts because of their charm and because they got people to like them. I mean, think of Ted Bundy. So I think it's definitely more realistic, and it just makes him more of an iconic person. Like, we think of the one-liners that he says. He is imitating Crocodile Dundee.
That's not a knife. This is a knife.
That's what makes really memorable villains, and I think that John Jarratt does an amazing job making Mick Taylor just this despicable but very engaging villain. And I think in the States, we have to talk about him more. I haven't seen Wolf Creek 2. John Jarratt reprises his role as Mick Taylor, so I'm sure it's just even more evil deliciousness from him. Next, we have yet another villain. I told you there are a lot more villains on this list compared to the underrated women in horror. And this time it is Lord Summerisle from the original Wicker Man. And that's played by the incomparable Christopher Lee. Of course, we know Christopher Lee as Dracula from Hammer Horror's Dracula movies, and he is definitely iconic in those, there is no denying. But I think that we really need to give him more credit for Lord Summerisle. Again, it's another villain who is very based in reality in that he is a very charming, very likable, very suave person. Very akin to the cult leaders of the time. You think of your Charles Mansons and things like that. They have to be likable in order to get people to follow them. And he definitely comes across as this very interesting and sophisticated man who just happens to run a cult on an island. And I did read that Christopher Lee actually helped pay for the rights to The Wicker Man to make it into a movie, which is amazing. And that he did not get paid for acting in the film either. So it is really a passion project for him, and that really shines through in his performance. And of course, we get the unforgettable scene of him in front of the burning Wicker Man. His hair is all wild and flying in the wind. And Christopher Lee is just a true horror icon and absolutely deserves more credit for his role as Lord Summerisle. The Wicker Man is just one of the best horror films of the 70s in my opinion, and I always love a good folk horror movie as well. So I think we definitely need to be talking more about Lord Summerisle. Next is another twofer, and that is Peter and Paul from the original Funny Games from 1997. Peter is played by Frank Gehring, and Paul is played by Arno Frisch. And they are these young men who are going around in a town in Austria. It's kind of like a vacation area, and they are invading these people's homes and killing them. And they are doing it by weaponizing the hospitality of the families. So they look like very clean-cut, very nice young men who are dressed in their all-white golf gear, looking very of the area. They don't look out of place at all. And they kind of just push in on this family. First, they just ask for some eggs, and then they stay a little too long, and it progresses to where they take this family hostage in their own home. And again, this is another set of villains that reminds me a lot of real life people, because we have Paul and Peter, Paul being the more aggressive, more confident one, and Peter being a little bit more hesitant, kind of just a follower of Paul. And that reminds me a lot of some of the killer pairs that we see, like in the Columbine shootings with Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. One is more of the leader and one's more of the follower. So we get that dynamic with Peter and Paul. So Paul being the leader is definitely more scary to me because he just has no remorse. He is an absolute sociopath. We never see him questioning what he's doing. And Peter is scary too because he just goes along with it. And the fact that the characters break the fourth wall in the film is so different. And I know the director Michael Haneke did do a shot-for-shot remake of Funny Games in 2007, so 10 years after the original, all in English. I think he just wanted to have it more accessible for like an American audience. So I haven't seen that one, and I assume because it is a shot-for-shot and just verbatim of the original, that the characters of Peter and Paul are essentially the same. But I definitely should watch that one to compare and see if their acting varies at all. But just having these almost fratty looking guys just weasel their way into a home and just commit these heinous acts of violence for seemingly no reason is absolutely terrifying. Funny Games is probably one of my favorite home invasion movies, and we definitely need to be talking about Peter and Paul as a dynamic horror duo way more. And last but not least is Arkin from The Collector. Arkin is played by Josh Stewart, who, I don't know why, I just really have a soft spot for Josh Stewart. I've really only seen him in The Collector, and he's been in a couple other things, but I don't know, it's something about his voice and his mannerisms. He's just a very, kind-seeming person. And in The Collector, he plays a construction worker who his family is in some trouble with some loan sharks, so the house that he's working on is owned by these rich people. And he thinks, well, I will rob from these rich people. I'm familiar with their house so that we can pay off these loan sharks. And while he's in the process of robbing the house at night, he realizes that there's a masked killer in the house who is setting up booby traps and taking this family hostage. He's literally collecting people, which is why he's called the Collector. So he can either try to escape the house without alerting the Collector of his presence, or he can try to save this family that he was trying to rob. And that's what he ends up doing. He kind of becomes this reluctant hero, and he navigates the booby traps and fights the Collector. He's really smart, and just watching him go through and try to get around the booby traps and outsmart the Collector is so interesting. And Josh Stewart just makes Arkin really likable. We know that he's not really a bad guy, he's just trying to save his family. But when it comes down to it, he really values human life and this family that he helps them even though it puts his own life at jeopardy. And I don't really ever hear anyone talking about Arkin, and I think that The Collector is kind of an underrated film in general, but definitely the character of Arkin is super underrated. So I definitely wish more people talked about Josh Stewart and his portrayal of Arkin. So that's all my underrated men in horror on this list. There was 12 characters technically, and definitely more villains on this list, which I found really interesting. I'm not sure why I gravitated to more villains for the men as opposed to the women, but I think we just see in general more male villains and more female protagonists in horror. So comment below with who you think is an underrated male character in horror. Of course, I haven't seen every single horror movie ever, so if there's someone that I missed on this list, please comment below and let me know. I would love to hear y'all's thoughts. And maybe I will end up doing an underrated horror villains video. I'm not sure. I've got to think about that. So let me know your thoughts for that as well. Who is an underrated horror villain in your opinion? And please, if you feel inclined, like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. And all my socials are linked down below if you want to follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd or anything like that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and we'll talk horror next time.